Give this file away, fam.
Jane Philpott was shuffled into Treasury Board, leaving Seamus O'Regan to become Indigenous Services Minister, leaving Jody Wilson-Raybould to become Veterans Affairs Minister. Wait, what? Justice/Attorney General to Veterans Affairs? It seemed like a clear demotion to everyone, except Wilson-Raybould herself.
I can think of no world in which I would consider working for our veterans in Canada as a demotion.
Wilson-Raybould's shuffle morphed into a scandal a month later. A Globe and Mail report suggested she'd been demoted for resisting pressure to intervene in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin.
Did the Prime Minister...
It dominated the House on a day, ironically enough, when the Indigenous Languages Act was to get second reading.
Everyone was so proud when the Attorney General, the Justice Minister of Canada, was an Indigenous woman, and we congratulated her on her amazing success. We are now learning that this government threw her under the bus.
I would have thought that all members of this House would have more respect for our veterans than to consider transfer to the Ministry of Veterans Affairs as being thrown under the bus.
The Prime Minister tried damage control.
The allegations in the Globe story this morning are false. Neither the current nor the previous Attorney General was ever directed by me or by anyone in my office to take a decision in this matter.
Days later, Wilson-Raybould resigned from Cabinet. So did Jane Philpott. And Gerald Butts, Trudeau's principal secretary. He also quit. For weeks, everyone wanted to hear from Wilson-Raybould. Then on February 27th, she spoke before the Justice Committee, confirming that she felt tremendous pressure to intervene in the SNC-Lavalin prosecution.
I asked, quote, "Are you politically interfering with my role, my decision as the Attorney General? I would strongly advise against it," end quote. The Prime Minister said, no, 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 we just need to find a solution.
Then, a few days later, the Prime Minister made this announcement.
Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott are no longer members of the Liberal caucus.
Other things of interest did happen in Ottawa. Just before the scandal, Bill C-91, the Indigenous Languages Act, was tabled. Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Natan Obed wasn't happy with the bill. It didn't make Inuktitut an official language like French and English. But AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde praised it.
So this piece of legislation is filling up Section 35 for language rights to be there. And if they're language, they're constitutional rights. They're inherent rights, they're constitutional rights. They should be adequately resourced.
And before she resigned, Jane Philpott joined Indigenous leaders when Bill C-92, Child Welfare Reform, was tabled.
And we've done some really, really important things that I'm tremendously proud of as a government. But I don't think there's anything as important as this.
Both bills received royal assent in June, but one that didn't was C-292. Back in May, the bill's sponsor, Romeo Saganash, appeared before the Senate. He wanted senators to pass the bill, but also had to explain what C-262 would do.
We're making sure that all of our laws for the coming years stemming out of the Parliament of Canada are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Debate in the Senate over Bill C-262 was sometimes tense, as Conservative senators were accused of stalling tactics.
I'd like to ask Senator Sinclair to withdraw the motive he's imputed to me of running out the clock.
Really? I don't think so. I'm called to question.
Despite a rally of support outside the Senate back in June, the bill died on the order paper when the Senate rose for the summer.
Don't let anyone take your voice away.
Protests are a common occurrence on Parliament Hill. Soon into the new year, there was a protest in support of Indigenous people from British Columbia, who are fighting a proposed natural gas pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory. In the crowd, a familiar face.
I'm pretty concerned and preoccupied by what's going on, especially in 2019, in a supposedly era of reconciliation. Just these kind of things are not supposed to happen.
Our lands, our seas, there is no planet B.
Perhaps the biggest one was the climate strike back in September. Several thousand crowded Parliament Hill. One of the most unique protests was this Whig mom on the street outside the Indigenous building. Algonquin Grand Chief Verna Polson held a hunger strike here over the July 1st long weekend. She was upset there was no Algonquin representation in the building given to the three major Indigenous organizations in 2017.
Our ancestors gave up this land for everyone to live here in harmony, but still yet they don't respect the Algonquin people.
And then there were the press conferences, and more press conferences, and still more, not to mention all the official signings of documents, agreements, and memorandums of understanding. This one with three Métis provincial organizations stood out. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett was there to sign a self-agreement MOU with them.
Finally, Canada recognizes our right to self-government. I have always believed that once we get the recognition right, everything else will fall into place.
Inquiry.
Commissioner Buller is Cree.
Probably the biggest thing all year was the Murdered and Missing Women and Girls Inquiry, and its long-anticipated release of its report back in June. The Prime Minister attended the event at the Museum of History in Gatineau.
And it must end.
Many who attended were optimistic but cautious about the report and its over 200 recommendations.
What political will is going to come out of this, whether they're in power or in opposition or a backbencher. I'm looking at this as a challenge for Canadians, Canadian governments, and Canadian representatives.
The families' voices were clearly heard. Canada's dirtiest little secret is out now.
The year ends with a minority Liberal government, with a new Indigenous Services Minister in Montreal MP, Mark Miller, and Manitoba Métis MP Dan Vandel, the lone Indigenous voice in Cabinet, as the new Northern Affairs Minister. I'm Todd Lamirande, APTN National News, Ottawa.